Happy Halloween, everyone. I am really happy to see such a festive and not dressed up in costume audience. A little disappointed, have to say, but really excited about today's 90-minute discussion with this great panel of experts to talk about blockchain today. So we are going to be talking about blockchain in healthcare. We are going to be talking about what is the reality, what is the possibility, and everything in between with our esteemed audience, our esteemed panel members who are experts in their own right, each of them in both technology and everything in innovation, but blockchain specifically. So we have a really packed agenda. We sent out some pre-reading and everything else. I'm Lori McGraw. I am the Senior Vice President of Health Solutions. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. And before we dive into what we're going to be talking about, I wanted to give a really brief history of blockchain. I'm going to try and do it in 2 minutes or less, and then we'll get to fill in all the blanks of what I left out. You have to have been under a rock and asleep for the past year and a half if you haven't heard about blockchain. It is an emerging, disruptive, but only 10 years old technology that is out there. And if you haven't heard of blockchain, I'm pretty confident that you have heard about Bitcoin. $6,261 it costs to buy a Bitcoin today. And if you go to the convenience store that's nearby my apartment, then you can get a Bitcoin out of a machine with a card, which is kind of interesting. But we probably want to know a little bit about Bitcoin only because blockchain is the technology that supports it underneath. Just to give you some of the history of Bitcoin, the emergence of Bitcoin, which talks about some of the history of blockchain. This really started with a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto. We all want to know who he is, and nobody does, although there's lots of theories about who this guy is. 2008, he puts it is not. Well, maybe it is, but he is the 44th most rich person in the world, valued at over $19 billion. So if it is one of you guys, I am very interested in spending more time with you. But 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto puts out a white paper, and it is called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Again, blockchain is the technology that supports the Bitcoin. You can think about what blockchain is to Bitcoin, the internet is to email. We're talking about distributed ledgers and platforms that support applications that sit on top of it. 2008, Satoshi's white paper comes out. 2009 is when the first transaction between Satoshi and a guy named Hal Finney does the first transaction. It works. And in 2010, the first transaction actually happened on the blockchain. That was the purchase of a 10,000 Bitcoin pizza. Back in 2010, that cost about $25. And today, that same pizza, if you bought it with the 10,000 Bitcoins, it would be worth about $63 million. 3 years later, blockchain is live, the Bitcoin is happening. 3 years later, it's $1 billion worth of value in Bitcoin. At this point, Satoshi disappears. He gives away the rights to the use of the open source code to someone else, and he disappears off the face of the map, even though we don't know who he is. There's a lot of speculation about this guy, Satoshi. There are many theories of who he is. Elon Musk had to come out publicly and say it was not him. He is not Satoshi Nakamoto. But so he is sort of the Dread Pirate Roberts to us. 2010, 2013, we're at $1 billion. 2015, in terms of just 5 years later, we've got an amazing amount of disruption in blockchain that we're seeing in the financial industry. We have probably thousands of different digital currencies that are being put, not just Bitcoin. There's many, many more that are out there. We'll hear about some of them. But the financial industry is doing a lot with blockchain. Today's panel discussion is about healthcare. But in 10 years, we have seen an amazing amount of innovation happening in the financial industry. And just for kicks, I spent this morning looking on the internet to just find out what were the latest blockchain headlines in terms of what's happening out there. 2015, just 3 years ago, NASDAQ announced their first trials with blockchain in terms of what they were doing. And just yesterday, NASDAQ announced a pretty significant partnership with Microsoft based on the increasing demand that they are seeing with the need for blockchain kinds of applications. They can't keep up. Their partnership with Microsoft is to build out more in that realm, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. So that's your history lesson on blockchain, a little bit about Bitcoin, but let's turn to the experts. So here's who we have on our panel today. You've all got bio sheets in front of you, but we have Joe Hernandez, who goes by Disruption Joe, to my right here, who is the founder of Chicago Blockchain Project. He is all about accelerating change and going from a competitive to a cooperative type of model. And Joe, we're going to be really looking forward to hearing from you. Right next to him, we have Dr. Conrad Barsky, who is the founder and CEO of Forward Blockchain. And actually, with my panelists, Conrad is the only one wearing blue jeans, so I think that he actually may be Satoshi. So I just want to point that out. He is a physician who then became a technologist. He is an author and written several books about the blockchain. We're going to hear more about from Conrad in just a minute. Right next to him, we have Ron Wintz. Ron Wintz, also a founder and a CEO of Mindshift, and this is a healthcare company that's focused on getting rid of the administrative plumbing in healthcare specifically with advanced technologies like blockchain. Next to him, we have Dr. Chris Pavlatos, who another founder, CEO, and physician, who is the founder of Patient MD. And what Chris is going to be talking to us about is, from the patient's perspective, what are the type of applications of blockchain in healthcare that we might be thinking about? And then closing us out, we're going to hear from Charles Unger. He is the managing director of Health 2047, so part of the family here at the AMA. And Charles, who is a technology entrepreneur, was one of the architects of Akiri, which was the first company spin-out of Health 2047 that is based on, it's a data liquidity company, but based on blockchain principles. We have from Charles just what will be a broad view of some of the really large changes in healthcare where disruptive technologies like blockchain could be helping out. So that's enough from me. We're going to go to a couple different perspective discussions from our esteemed panel. What we want to really get out of today's conversation is we want to make sure that you know a little bit more about blockchain than you already do. And why should the AMA care about blockchain? We want you to be thinking about this, thinking about your area, but we fundamentally believe this is an important technology for us to understand. It might be disruptive, and we might create all kinds of new opportunities, but we as the AMA must certainly be aware of advanced things happening in technology. This is a technology-focused conversation. Hashtag AMA blockchain. If you want to tweet it out, please do. Todd Unger thanks you in advance. Joe, Disruption Joe, can you tell us about what the blockchain is all about?
Yes, well, first I'm going to show you why they call me Disruption Joe, because I need to stand up to really teach you guys here. Thank you for the introduction. That was actually amazing. And the reason I'm here is with Chicago Blockchain Project, I've been hosting meetups and events. Every few weeks, we let people come and ask any questions they want about blockchain. So for the last year and a half, I've been finding what actually works to help people understand what it is. And for me, it's a sort of infrastructure. We have lots of protocols in our day-to-day lives. These are things that we do to make sure that we can communicate and work together efficiently. When you get up in the morning, you walk out of your bedroom, and the door is exactly a certain size so that if somebody were to break through your door for some reason, you could go and buy another one and it'll fit perfectly. We've set up a system of standards to allow us to communicate. So digitally, we don't have the same type of infrastructure that we do in the rest of the world. It would be absolutely insane if I said to you, you're starting a new business? Well, you're gonna have to build a set of roads. You're gonna need to make your own electrical grid. And if you wanna do business with somebody else, you're gonna need to figure out how to pay for a way to tie those in together to everybody else's grids, right? It seems ridiculous, but that's what we're doing digitally. And the internet was the first protocol we had that digitally said, here's how you can collaborate with other people around the world and you can send them information. But as opposed to the internet or the real world where I have something and I hand it to her and now she has this, we set it up that you make copies, right? If you send 20 of an email out, who has it? Who owns it? Right? So when we made this protocol, when Satoshi, actually it's a 10-year anniversary today of the release of the white paper, the first thing he was thinking was, how can we create this system that allows people to trust not just that the contents of the ledger are good, but that the governance of that ledger isn't something that could be corrupted or colluded. So I want you to imagine a big trust lever here. And on this side, you're trusting one person. Think about this. This is a person who has administrative rights to that database. They could just change some of the information at any given time. And the problem with that is corruption. What if that person's just a jerk? What about, raise your hand if you've seen Jurassic Park. What if Newman from Jurassic Park works for you? It's probably a bad idea. Now, raise your hand if you can name one company that hasn't been hacked into yet, other than the AMA. And these four glorious companies here.
Thank you, Leslie Weber.
You can see the problems right there. And then we take this trust lever and we move it over and we say, well, maybe we'll do a system where the 5 of us will hold keys. And unless 3 out of 4 of us are there, we can't change the rules. So we'll make up a certain rule set of, if my balance goes down 10, somebody else's has to go up 10. That just makes sense, right? Conrad shouldn't go up by 100 when we're doing a $10 to $10 transaction. That wouldn't work. So we needed to make a system for that. And we could kind of trust inside our organization, our little membership group of like the 5 or so that were putting together. So we could do things where we could assign who owns this, and that could be trusted internally of our system. But in a global currency, what Bitcoin was looking for was this peer-to-peer cash system that no government could seize or censor or shut down. And this came because they tried to build digital cash in many different ways before, and it never fared well with the governments. Let's just leave it at that. So when he started this system, he said anybody can run the software and we'll have an unknown number of participants in the system. If you want to hook up your computer, you can. And by having more computers looking at it, it's more secure. Instead of just 5 of us holding the keys, now a bunch of us. And if we do that, we're going to have to come up with a voting system. So the system in Bitcoin kind of says, if I was voting for gay marriage, I would wear my gay marriage hat. And you guys, as we talked and I said, this is a good idea, you would start signaling that I'm in for it. And once 90% of the people voted for it and were wearing their gay marriage hat, the other 10% would be seceded from the union. And that's a very interesting opt-in because it allows the value to be placed where people's values are before they're willing to just opt out of a system. So Bitcoin, we take that trust lever and we say, we don't need to trust any one or consortium of participants. We can trust that because everybody is looking at it, it's going to work the best. Now, it brings up a problem though. Why are people going to pay for electricity to run their computers? And check this. Is it just because they have some sort of stake in the system? Or is it because we're actually creating the system that gives an incentive? In our monetary systems, we have a central bank that is allowed to inflate the currency. And they have to make decisions, and they answer through our systems, our political systems. In Bitcoin, they actually built it in as a mechanism to secure the network. To get more people to look at this, it actually pays out a steady, small inflation rate that as the value of this goes up, imagine you're in college and you start running your computer and all of a sudden you can buy beer. What would your friends ask you? What are you doing, right? And you say, I'm running my computer at night and I just run this Bitcoin program, and then at the end of the month I can buy you guys all beers. And they would all start running their computers. Now think what that did. That made, let's say there was 5 friends, it just made that system 5 times stronger. That many more eyeballs are looking at making sure with every single transaction. So one thing I want to get across to you from the beginning is that, to me, blockchain is about an open and generally permissionless system. There are many permission blockchain use cases that make a lot of sense. With currency, it's very hard to do that because the incentives are so high, the stakes so strong, that it tends to have this cartelling effect. If somebody has the power to say, yes, you have permission or you don't to be a part of this system on the ledger. But for other systems, if you give permission to them because they're a part of your club or your group or your organization, it has a lot of value because within the members of that organization, you still need to keep account of the things that you agree on. And you can choose to be a part of it or choose not to. The intended purpose of blockchains. Now, this is a lot like people say, does anybody know? Raise your hand if you think porcupines can shoot their quills. Can they shoot them? Yeah. All right. The answer is no. But wisdom-wise, the intention of somebody telling you that is so you don't get messed up by a porcupine. If your mom tells you that, it's probably a good idea. She's not really lying. She has your best intention. So the intended purpose of blockchains was, and what Bitcoin did 10 years ago, was bringing together open source software and cryptography and economics, or what they're calling game theory. And it made a balance of this system that has gotten hundreds of thousands of people to collaborate on one goal, creating a secure global currency for 10 years, without a boss, without a company, without any written guidelines or directives other than just, this is how you plug into the system. If you want to participate, be a part of it. So that's the amazing disruptive part of it. Now we're saying, if you can do that with currency, you can do that with anything of value. Land titles, anything where we have to know the information is just true. And I think Conrad will get more into the privacy side of things and where we're going from here.
I think that's great, Joe, and I think that's a really great start for our conversation to lay some groundwork about this distributed ledger kind of platform that's out there. Starts with trust in terms of a really key consideration, but there are other considerations like privacy and other things. So Conrad, maybe you can start to walk us through what other things we should be thinking about when we think about the blockchain.
I'm going to talk about privacy, but the first question I want to ask is, like, why do we care about this in medicine? And the key reason is there's something in common between finance and medicine, and that's the concept of a digital signature. So if you have a bank account and you want to spend money out of the bank account, we need some kind of proof that you are the correct account holder. And the way Bitcoin solves this is by allowing you to maintain a password basically on your computer. It's called a private key. And when you create a message to say, oh, I want to spend a certain amount of money, you can sort of mark that message using this secret information in your password. And then other people can verify that the person who is asking to spend this money is the person who owns the secret, and that person is the account holder. So So now we basically know as a fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum and the main cryptocurrencies have the most secure digital signing mechanism that's ever been created, because we have empirical evidence that people have stored billions of dollars in these currencies for years without any compromise to the low-level digital signing protocol. So you could see immediately that the same signing mechanism would work great for things like when a doctor signs a prescription, or when a state bureaucrat signs that somebody has a particular type of medical license. So wouldn't we want to use that exact same security for digital signing? So that's the place where these things overlap, and that's why this technology is interesting in medicine. Now, there is one big difference, though, and that is that when we care about digital signatures in medicine, we think of it from the perspective of employees. So I might be able to sign something on behalf of my employer, but if I lose my employment or I change roles, that digital signature, I should no longer be able to create the same digital signature. And so that concept doesn't exist in Bitcoin. Once you own a Bitcoin account, you have the information to use that to create signatures with that forever, basically, until all the money is spent. So we need some extra concept where we know, is this person currently an employee? Has their boss sent a message saying, hey, this guy no longer works here, please don't accept the digital signature? So that's where things are different with medicine. And but the same technology is still useful, because one of the things that Bitcoin has is this concept of a data commons. There's sort of this magic place where you can store data in the sky, which is the blockchain. And if I buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, I need to make sure that if somebody buys a cup of coffee from me, that they didn't spend that exact same money with someone else. And the way you tell that with Bitcoin is you make sure that there isn't already a transaction spending the same money in this common data area. And we want to use that same concept now with employers, where an employer can say, hey, they can broadcast a message and say, hey, this person no longer works here, don't accept their digital signature. And but it's more complicated with digital signatures, again, because of this, because you have to know about what the org chart is, who's allowed to revoke whose signature, and those sorts of things. And that's where, if you hear about smart contracts, that's what smart contracts allow you to do. So we're not going to talk a lot about smart contracts here, but it's basically a more sophisticated way of creating relationships between digital signatures and giving rights to different parties in that way. Now, so that's to me like the main value of Bitcoin. Now, the main obstacle in medicine is that privacy is very important, and basically blockchain is the least private technology ever invented. Because the whole goal of it is that if money is spent, that you can't spend it again. So there has to be some very reliable way to let everybody know that this money has already been spent, and you should never accept that same money in a different context. So that particular idea in medicine is not really compatible with privacy. And so the only way to add privacy to blockchain technology is by coming up with something more complicated. And there's essentially 4 different ways that people try to do this, and they all have trade-offs. And so I'll just kind of briefly go over those. So you can see the 4 approaches over there. So the first approach for adding privacy to blockchain is to just not worry about it, to just say, oh, we're just going to handle data where privacy isn't important. Now, there isn't a lot of data like that in medicine. Now, one example might be certain aspects of medical licenses, which are supposed to be on the public record. You might be able to put those in this public data structure. There's also other things, such as maybe product catalogs for pharmaceutical companies, or things like inspection reports, and these kinds of things. They may not have privacy concerns. And so you could imagine building medical applications without privacy that use blockchain technology. But again, the use cases there are very limited. The second approach, which is the first one that most technologies think of when they think of how to add privacy to medicine, is why don't we just stick a blockchain into a data center? And as long as we keep track of who can connect to that data center, we can keep that data private. And this is usually called a private chain or a permissioned ledger. And most medical projects currently use that approach. Now that approach has two main drawbacks. Now I should say I think there's many valid use cases for it, but the two main broad drawbacks are, number one, that it adds a lot of complexity. So blockchain technology by itself is already hard to develop for, and now you're adding all the additional traditional issues you have to deal with a data center in terms of DevOps and containerization and firewalls and networking. And so now you've doubled the complexity of your project. The other problem with it is security. The whole point of as Joe was saying, is you want a lot of eyeballs to validate all this information. So if you put it in the data center, you no longer have that. You don't have a lot of eyeballs, and you have to trust that the owner of that data center is going to act properly to safeguard the data. Now, one way around that is to have several data centers from different companies participate to maintain the data. This is called a consortium chain. And that does work, and lots of projects like that are currently being worked on. The problem there is that it adds another layer of magnitude to the complexity. So these projects have been kind of slow to get off the ground, but there's promise there. The third approach is let's just have two different places we put our data. We put some data on the blockchain, and we put some data just in the data center using traditional tools. And then we somehow have the two talk to each other. And this is one example where digital signatures make sense. So it makes sense that we might store people's signatures in a public space, saying, yes, this doctor is allowed to access this data at this hospital, and then and we keep that public. But then the data itself is just in a traditional database, in a traditional network, and the web services at that in that data center simply look at the blockchain to see, hey, is this person allowed to look at this information? So that's another promising approach. Now, the final approach is, hey, what if we just encrypt all the data? So we put it all in the public space and get all the security benefits, but we encrypt everything. Now, this ends up being not as promising as you might think, because the whole point behind validation and having people look at the information and validating it is they have to be able to understand what the data is. So if it's encrypted, it's not so useful. So, but there's different schemes you can come up with public key cryptography or symmetric key cryptography. Now, one approach that's popular and may be the ultimate solution to all of this in the future is something called homomorphic encryption or zero knowledge proofs. So this is a technology where you can have it both encrypted and people can still somehow validate it, even though they can't read what it is. So anyway, so these are the different ways of that you can try to bring together privacy with blockchain, but there's no real clean solution right now. And if you talk to any vendor that's promising a blockchain solution, you should try to figure out what box they're in and think about what are the drawbacks going to be of that particular box, and keep that in mind.
So that's great, Conrad. And I think part of the reason that we, spending some time on privacy, because as we think about blockchain in the use of healthcare and patient data, privacy has all of these other things that we need to consider. And when you talk about things like magical data commons and other things and permissions-based, hacking is a really big consideration. What is the complexity of the technology underneath, and how do we ensure that we can't penetrate it in ways when we start talking about patient data? So this has been a really great grounding in terms of some of the technology and the workings of the blockchain, and then applications that again sit on the platform. But Ron, just as you with Mindshift and talk about to some of the other technologies that you do in Mindshift, how should we think about the blockchain in healthcare? What might be some use cases for actually taking advantage of this kind of technology? We'll just switch.
Yeah, there you go. Can everybody hear me okay? So yeah, to Conrad's point, there's not a use case out there that's just solely blockchain based. Our technology is built on a combination of artificial intelligence and blockchain together, which allows us to solve a much broader set of problems. I think in general, what we're seeing is that transactional processing and that kind of stuff is the biggest need in the market and probably the earliest adoption. When you get into clinical use cases, you get into a lot more complexity that certainly the combination of the technologies can work towards, but transactional problems like the $1 trillion we spend on healthcare administration, those are good places that you can go much faster to try and get some impact. So right now, we're actually working with some large healthcare providers and payers doing prior authorization using some of the capabilities that Conrad mentioned on blockchain and machine learning, artificial intelligence combined together. So with that use case, you can, for example, complete a prior authorization in less than 5 minutes, meaning that while the patient's still in your office, you can get their prior authorization approved. You can find out what their eligibility is, what their out-of-pocket responsibility is, and their prior authorization's complete before they have to make a decision on whether they want that care. So that's use cases that we're actively doing today. We're also working on some use cases around physician credentialing. And it's the combination of the technologies that make it work. The idea being, yeah, you can make all of this information available, the transactions, all that stuff, but how do you make sure that it's clean information? How do you make sure that you've validated and done some predictive modeling around basically that information that's available so that you can make it more useful? So that's another example of a use case that we think has a lot of legs to it. And then another one that's most recent to us that we're starting to work on is peer-to-peer data exchange between big pharma companies. All of that's built on a very common platform, a combination of machine learning and blockchain. But what it allows us to do is take advantage of the things that Joe and Conrad were talking about, meaning trust, cryptographic protection of data, making it available only peer-to-peer, certain permission rights available so that only certain people can see it at the right time. But then where you need to be able to expose information like, did this patient go to 5 different doctors and get the same prescription? Did this patient submit, or did a provider potentially duplicate submitting of a prior authorization request because they didn't know that the payer had already received it and they thought, well, maybe I need to resubmit it so I can get a response back. The ability to know what and predict out what kind of payments we can expect in the next 90, 180 days. Those are all real use cases that are alive today that take advantage of those combinations of technology. And so that's the kind of the claims process, which is where we're spending most of our time. We're finding that there's a lot of excitement around the ability to take things that happen party to party, which have been very difficult to figure out how to automate. Blockchain and machine learning allow us to automate those party to party transactions and be able to do it in a very fast, very precise way. Even to a point of making sure that the right information is made available at the right time to the right party with the right types of permissions that are set. So all that's built on the technology that Joe and Conrad were just articulating. The data exchange piece of it is always a stickler. It's one thing that we run into a lot around discussions with providers and payers both. And blockchain provides you the ability to do that. You can set up certain specific channels within blockchain to say, hey, I have a data set that you need to give me a clinical approval for a prior authorization. You don't write that to the blockchain. It's just not big enough to scale for that. So then how do you solve that problem? Well, blockchain does allow you to at least expose the data and say, here's where you go get it, and then control how long that data is available so that the payer can look at it, review it, and then provide their review as fast as possible. The other things that you can do on blockchain that solve a lot of these, and Conrad mentioned it briefly, with smart contracts. Smart contracts are really just nested if-then statements. If this is the case, then this is what you get out. And you just put a few of those together, and you can really kind of emulate a decision-making process. So we rely heavily on smart contracts that we build out that have all the payer rules in it, and it also has private rules in it. So there are some things that the payer makes available to everybody, says here if you want to submit a prior auth or you want to submit a claim, or if you need to know eligibility, these are all required by everybody. But then there are private contractual things, for example, pricing, or for example, terms on when you're going to get paid. Those things you don't want everybody else to see. So that allows you then to be able to do that in a very private way so that you can provide both the data as well as the actual transactions independent. And so you still get the idea of all the consensus stuff that Joe talked about, where more than half the parties that are on it have to say, yep, that's a real transaction. Yep, that's a real party. yep, that person can actually, it does have the permissions to participate, but you don't necessarily have to expose private data. You can use those smart contracts, and you can the combination of smart contracts and encryption to keep those parties that shouldn't be a part of it out. So the big thing that when we first started the company was, this whole idea around how do you automate processes, how do you do process automation, and there's some technologies out there, but the ability to automate between parties, because at the end of the day, healthcare is a team sport. There's not one entity that gets to make every decision all by themselves. So how do you facilitate that? Well, blockchain begins to provide a lot of that infrastructure for you to do that when applied the right way. And there's just a ton of really interesting things happening as far as the way that technology is evolving to make it faster. There was always, if you go look at the original Bitcoin blockchain, very, very slow. Takes a long time to get a single transaction done, and now we're getting up into the millions of transactions per second. So it can support the types of things that happen in healthcare, whereas it couldn't do that before in the past. So those are some of the kind of the more practical applications that we're working on and that we're seeing kind of entering the market today. So.
Thanks, Ron. I mean, that's actually really great. So, probably had like, half a dozen to a dozen different practical applications. Great that you led off with prior authorization. I think, some of the work that we spent a lot of time on here at the AMA are the things that create burden for physicians. And right after electronic health records, prior authorization is one of the top ones there, and there's a lot of work needed. So getting things down to the types of timetables you were talking about, we are very excited to hear about that. But I think, Chris, one of the other sides of practical applications we heard about, for the physicians and sort of like in the middle of, the care for patients. But what about maybe from the patient side, and what should we be thinking about there as it relates to blockchain?
Before I talk about that, just to review again the 5, I think, key uses of blockchain in healthcare. One is the revenue cycle management, as you talked about. Provider credentialing is probably the second one. The use of blockchain in clinical trials and academic research to identify patients. Supply chain management, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, because there's over $200 billion of fraudulent drugs. But the one area that's going to have the greatest effect in the industry and for the patient is patient record management. What this does, blockchain does, if you could describe blockchain in 2 words, what it does is create distributed trust. It gives trust to the patient of who has the data. And what the blockchain does allows the patient to control their own data. What a novel idea. Where the patient controls their data, and it allows you then to manage the sharing of the data, creates interoperability, and creates the security that's needed to create the data liquidity that we need to see in the marketplace. Ultimately, what this does then for the patient, it allows us to create that complete longitudinal health record, which is critical. It allows us not just to capture all the patient's clinical data, but now we can begin creating the trust from the patient of adding their genomic data to their patient record, and then on top of it, add patient-generated data, which is from IoT devices, which includes the sensors, devices you may have at home. And studies have shown that within 5 years, patient-generated data from IoT devices is going to be more clinically relevant than clinical data coming from a doctor's office or from a hospital. Why? Because from a doctor, we get episodic data. We're just getting a picture of that patient at that one point in time, versus patient-generated data could be continuous monitoring data. So when you look at having a complete record, where does that value come in? If you look at where the marketplace is going, healthcare is moving into a patient-centered, value-based industry that's going to be providing precision medicine and personalized healthcare for the patient. And data liquidity is critical for that. Now, the one factor that's going to be critical to promote that type of marketplace is patient engagement. That's the one thing that we're all working on. And all these electronic health records from the Epics and the Cerners have all these portals that give you access to your data, which is okay. But that's not what patients want, and that's not what's going to engage patients. Patients don't know what to do with the data. What patients want is actionable information that can allow you to manage your health and your well-being. That's what patients want. And having a complete record now allows us then to use technology such as clinical decision support, predictive analytics, and artificial intelligence to not only educate the patient, but now we can begin educating the doctor also on precision medicine and personalized healthcare specific to you. Now, that to me is valuable because it strengthens the patient-doctor relationship. On top of it, it may even lower our malpractice insurance because of better communication and better informing of the patient. So that to me is where one of the key values of blockchain. Now, on top of that, we use blockchain with smart contracts and cryptocurrency. Now we could build an incentive program to foster the right behavior by the patients. And here we refer to the nudge theory by Richard Thaler, which is here from the University of Chicago, won the Nobel Prize on economic behavior, where we can begin incentivizing patients for doing the right thing and begin gamifying the healthcare industry because the data is trusted because it's on the blockchain. An example is your employer or your insurance company could say, if you get a physical exam documented on the blockchain through a smart contract, I'm going to give you 50 tokens. Now, those tokens can then be used for other services in healthcare. Now, what are you doing? You're engaging patients. And what happens when patients get engaged? Outcomes improves, costs are lowered. An example of one of the initiatives that the AMA is doing, you're educating patient regarding diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, asthma, congestive heart failure. Very valuable. Imagine taking that information, those protocols, partnering with the employer and the payer community, and creating an incentive program around that if you as a patient, you have the criteria on a smart contract, for example, you're a diabetic. Number one, if you lose weight, that you could set the criteria in a smart contract. If you are more active through your Fitbit, documented through IoT devices and information added into blockchain, your hemoglobin A1C begins to get normalized. You see an ophthalmologist once a year, you see a podiatrist once a year. You met the criteria that could eventually execute a smart contract, which then compensates you through your employer or your insurance company with tokens or cryptocurrency, which then now all of a sudden you're incentivized. And now you've earned something that can be used for additional services. What does that do? Increases patient engagement. What happens when patients are engaged? Outcomes improves, costs lower, which is ultimately where the industry wants to go. So the benefit to the patient is huge. And the use of artificial intelligence and analytics is critical. But they're only as good as having the data. If you don't have the data, AI and predictive analytics and clinical decision support software to educate patients and doctors is limited. So you got to get the patient's data and you got to get the complete record. And that's what the blockchain can do and can create the trust where the patient controls it, decides who accesses the data, how they can use it, and gives them the confidence and trust that they need in order to make that happen. That's where I think blockchain can be extremely disruptive. And really put the patient and the doctor, again, in the center of healthcare, the patient in control.
That's great. And I think that we also need to think about it because, blockchain as a technology, it's a lot to sort of get your head around. But if you think about it from the patient's perspective, for them to be engaged, they don't need to know that they're engaging with the blockchain. That will be invisible. Applications will mask all of that from a patient's perspective. And I think that that's where, how we apply it with applications, again, that sit on top of the technology is really key. So that was really terrific. Charles, I want to go to you. And by the way, I just had a little pre-meeting with all of my esteemed panelists here that we've got Charles as the anchor, and it's our collective responsibility to keep Charles a little bit controlled because he gets kind of excited about this technology and all of its opportunity in healthcare. But Charles, just, from your perspective, you're an innovator, you're an entrepreneur, and you've been working in innovative technology for a lot of years. Healthcare has a lot of mega trends going on. I mean, Chris talked about some of them, but maybe you could talk to us a little bit more. What should we be paying attention to, and why would blockchain matter in some of those mega trends?
Get that on. So, as I said, it'll take me another 25 minutes now. So the good thing is, the world's changing around us every day, right? So we use Netflix, we use other technologies. All this technology is moving to the cloud. You've heard that for a long time. Companies that are not being disrupted are the ones that actually are turning around and not doing anything, right? They're not actually affecting themselves, and they're getting disrupted by everybody else. Everybody's moving to the cloud. How do you trust the cloud? Anybody got any ideas? Who uses Google? Use Dropbox. OneDrive, Netflix, Amazon, everybody, right? So how do you trust that the Amazon website is the Amazon website and you paid them? How do you trust you ordered that document or that item and it's actually come to you? Right? How do you trust that I'm actually Charles? By the way, there's two me's. Dangerous. There is actually two me's in the United States. I've had to have my ID changed completely. My social security number and everything has changed this last year. How do I deal with that? Disaster. Every time I need to do my filings, I'm going to have to ring the IRS. How do you do that? I had to change my credit cards, everything. The good news is my credit cards end all in 007 now, so somebody definitely knows who I am, right? So how do you do that? How do you do that going forward? How do you do that with what drugs I'm getting? If you get diagnosed with something, how do you affect that? How do I know that I can actually go across borders and I'm insured, I can have medical situations attended to, and move the dial? How do I know even if I can connect my mobile phone to that network? And we do that every day. We transpose our lives around a digital world that we live in. We buy tickets, right? We buy everything we do. We look at lettuces. I don't know if everybody saw, Walmart is actually bringing out a platform to monitor lettuce for E. coli, right? Monitoring is all around us. It's called data. And data is being used in many different ways, right? Data is not valuable unless you can use it. The historic provenance of something is important, and how you trust that is important. And that's what the infrastructure is providing to us today. And that around the aspects about what technology is doing, we're living in an infrastructure world. You know, Joe was talking about it. It is infrastructure today. It's not an application. Applications are built on top of infrastructure. Netflix is an application delivering you what we call in the tech world digital rights to movies. It says what you can do with it, how you can use it, and which parts of your family can do the same things. Yeah? Behind the scenes, the work is being done to do everything the guys have been talking about. But what has that done? It's disrupted the way that movies have been delivered to you. The same thing is happening in every part of the industry. It will happen in healthcare, guaranteed. When I worked in Abu Dhabi, it's how do we do transitional medicine around the world and do health tourism? How do I know it's me? And that's what's going to be one of the big drivers around the technology. And globally, that's going to be a bigger impact than you can ever imagine. Driving licenses, payments, passports, cross-border data validation. Who's heard of GDPR? Does anybody know what it actually does? Has anybody read it? One, there we go. One or two. Right? We've actually had an interesting thing in the United States that's actually affected by GDPR. It's called open borders around data. When you transition across an open border in the United States, leaving it digitally or in person, the US government can actually access your data. How many times does somebody access a website online that's not in America? How do you know you're doing that? How do you know that the EHR you're accessing is actually in the cloud that you think it's in? Does anybody know? You don't. The world we live in today is distributed. And what this technology brings to the table is distributed technology. Technology around how do you access your car, how do you have different aspects when you have an accident and the EMT comes and gets you out of the car. The ultrasound that got presented when you're actually having a new child coming along, was that actually tagged to the right information and given to the right place at the right time? The guys were saying how large amount of data you could actually capture. Right now, there is no way, absolutely no way, that an EHR could live in a blockchain. The data is too large. Petabytes and petabytes of data. And if we did the approaches that we're talking about, the proper approach of being completely distributed, every one of our computers would have to store that sort of data. Does anybody think that's possible today? Does anybody think that that's cheap to do? Pretty expensive, right? You used to be able to correlate the cost of blockchain and Bitcoin to the amount of electricity being used. Right? So these are the things that are happening. Continually, technology adapts. People adapt. We want to consume services. We have been all driven into that new world. Is it a bad thing? No, it's probably not. You know, we've been doing it for a long time. And I think the big changes that you're seeing across all of this is, how do we now validate the consumption that we're doing? How do we validate that I've got 20 devices? How many of you guys have got kids with more than one device at home? How many of you guys actually have a tracking tool on their phone? How many don't want to tell me you have a tracking tool on your phone? Now, in certain countries, that's illegal. Unless you've signed a contract with your child that they know about it. How many of you know that Apple track you? Right? How many signed the user license at the beginning to say, I actually accept using this mobile phone and I'd like to be tracked? Doesn't say that, right? But it actually is a digital certificate behind the scenes that actually is understanding what's going on, and you've authorized it. That is the way that things are going to be doing. The aspects of having infrastructure married to data creates what we call insights, outcomes. If you can't marry those two things up, you can't get outcomes. You can't get insights. Insights is about having knowledge and applying algorithms and questions and answers, if, then, ands, what we do in technology world, yeah, to a problem. You need data to do that. You apply those two together. You need storage and infrastructure to be able to run that information. You get outcomes. And that's where we're heading. Everybody today talks about insights and outcomes. Optum, everybody knows Optum, right? Anybody know how much Optum's actually value, how much money they make? $50 billion a year right now. What do they actually do? What did they do originally? Business process automation. Get data. Put data in their infrastructure. Invoices, information, more information. What do they actually sell out the back of that? Tools that give you insights. The companies they are buying and integrating are insight companies. Because we use insights. That's what Amazon does every day. There you go.
Charles, that's great. And so I think it's really pretty good. And so I also think you're actually starting to highlight some of the things that I actually want to ask all of you about. I mean, so Conrad, you talked about privacy as one of the things that we really need to consider in healthcare. And Charles, you started to talk about some of the other things, you know, that we might need to consider. Because everything that was said, I mean, blockchain sounds pretty great. There's a lot of really terrific opportunity in terms of all of the kinds of applications that we heard about from Ron and from Chris in terms of where blockchain could be applied. But it was 10 years, and 10 years is not a lot of time, but before we went from the 2008 paper on Bitcoin to now this incredible adoption and starting to be significant disruption in the financial industry. But when we think about healthcare, privacy, we've identified as a big concern, but what are the other things that we should be thinking about for blockchain that might, you know, we need to really consider in terms of obstacles to overcome? Ron, you mentioned scaling, and we're now doing lots more transactions. Maybe Conrad, I could start with you.
Yeah, so scaling is a big issue. There's sort of a trade-off. Do you want to have lots of people validating the data, and you use like an open blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum? In that case, the amount of data you can put in is rather limited because everybody has to interact with that data. On the other extreme, if you run a private ledger, you can just have a bunch of supercomputers in your data center, and then you can process some ridiculous number of transactions. But nobody has figured out the silver bullet yet. How do you get both distributed validation and a large number of transactions per second. There's sort of a trade-off there. Now, in order to solve that trade-off, the only way you can really do it is through something called sharding, where you basically say, we're not all going to validate everything. It's just that some people are going to validate different parts of it. And there's many teams right now working on these types of approaches. And it turns out it was a lot harder than everybody expected. The main problem is revolves around data availability. So I ask you to hold a piece of data on my behalf. You can think of something like Dropbox, where you're paying somebody rent for their hard drive, and so you can store a file on their system. So it turns out we don't really know how to do that, because if the person lies about it, and they say, yeah, I'm keeping your file, please pay me the rent, and then later on when you need it, it's not available, it turns out that's a really hard problem to solve. And so and that's probably like the biggest problem right now in blockchain, is figuring out when people promise to store data on other people's behalf, that they're really doing it. And if we can solve that, then you could have these systems where you really could get into tens of thousands of transactions and still have these really beautiful validation properties. But until that happens, the amount of data you can put on the blockchain, on a public blockchain, is really limited. So, for instance, we were doing an experiment putting medical licenses on a blockchain, and it comes out to be about, at the time it was about 50 cents per license, which is fine for a medical license, but it's still a lot of money if you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of licenses in a particular state. But you wouldn't be able to, for instance, put somebody's blood pressure on there, because it would just add up too quickly. So we have to figure out some way of having scalability, and the solution can't just be that you're going to pay a single centralized party to just run really powerful computers, and that's an unsolved problem.
So I didn't know about sharding, but Joe, you just told us that the blockchain was built on trust. So what's going on there?
So I see that there's a component of the blockchain that once you go to this system where you get away from one, you get to this consortium, we had to make that set of rules, like 3 out of 5 have to vote for it. And then when you get to a lot of people, this looks more like democracy, right? How do we make a decision all together? We're going to inset some rules. The difference, there's a term called crypto economics.
Did you really want to say this looks like democracy? Like, did you really? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. And it's funny, because Bitcoin's almost at the exact same point that the U.S. democracy is, in the fact that the way it provides its reward is a winner-takes-all system. So it encourages the factions to pool, so they get to be a part of the reward. Like, you all give 20 bucks in, one guy goes, gets a lottery ticket, and then somebody you can win, you got a better chance, right? And that's kind of almost like an emergent bug of like a winner-take-all system. So it turns out with like these public systems, the questions are, the data availability is one of the very difficult trade-offs. The other one is simple governance. And then once you have a governance structure in place, then how do you convince people that they should believe that that governance is better than the other system's governance? And now we get into politics again. So the most important things for you to understand if you're looking at public blockchains tends to also include economics, political science, and social, like just social sciences, behavior. And it becomes a very, very difficult system to enable.
How are you dealing with that, Ron? I mean, you talked about a couple applications that you're working on. So how are you getting that trust to get adoption?
So, to Conrad's point, we use a permissioned, but we also have a public side of our blockchain. It took us a while to build it that way, but basically it's a permissioned blockchain that started with that. That allows us then to kind of overcome some of the cycle time and scalability issues. But we're kind of taking a fairly pragmatic approach with this. The internet today doesn't look anything like the internet did 20, 30 years ago. Well, the same will happen with blockchain. But in order to get some value out of it, some functionality out of it, you take what you have today and you take a pragmatic approach and build things that work. And then over time, as the technology evolves, we will solve some of these things around scalability and permissions and that kind of stuff. For the healthcare world, though, there are really good use cases that can take advantage of this existing technology and solve some problems that we need to solve today that we don't have to wait 20 years to solve. So we're certainly, relying heavily on a kind of a more permission approach, but we have the ability to, and we will see more work in that permissionless environment.
And then Chris, do you have any other thoughts from the, like patient MD and just, obstacles that you see for adoption of blockchain?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is educate people about blockchain, because too many people immediately hear blockchain, oh, that's Bitcoin and Ethereum and stuff like that. And they hear all about the fraud that occurs in the industry, at least through the ICO world, and the volatility of cryptocurrency that some people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And you have to educate them that blockchain is not Bitcoin and it's not Ethereum. So I think there needs to be an education process. But like Ron, we also believe in a combined private-public blockchain. I think will be a big solution. A lot of information will be off-chain but hashed. So that is one problem. That's one way of solving some of that problem. The use of side chains, I think, is going to grow, and that will help solve that. And eventually, as we get new consensus algorithms that become more efficient, I think that
What
will
about
change.
governance, and what about managing when you get this sort of web of forks and web of, side chains and things of that nature? How do you think about that? And maybe Charles, I'll turf that to you.
So thanks. Answer blog. Go see my Forbes article on it. So governance is a really big deal. I look at this as the airline industry has changed over the last 20 years. Behind the scenes of the airline industry, you have a unique identifier when you book a ticket, right? It's randomly generated every single time it happens. That ticket gets put into a big supercomputer Unix environment, is distributed around the world, has every single airport and every single airline and every single plane connected to it. Transactions happen really fast. Now they've added bag tagging in and lots of other technology, right? So what have you put together around that? As Joe was saying and other people, you've ended up with a consortium scenario that's created individual entities around the world to control the airline industry. The FAA, the CAA, the Australian Air Force, Airlines Association, and lots of others around the world. There's in total about 15 organizations that map airspace. Yeah? And that mapping of the airspace and who controls what can fly and where is brought government entities together to control planes across boundaries. Right? So you look at mainland Europe and it controls it across many different airspaces and time continuums and airlines and tickets and everything else. We're going to need air traffic control for the new technologies that are coming out. And we're going to need organizations and teams to figure that out. My view is, I've been talking to Laurie for a long time. I think the AMA can play an amazing role in doing that. I think it's the only place, and I've listened to this for a lot of time, that really can be a Switzerland scenario that can bring other parties together globally, because amazingly or not, the AMA has an amazing global brand. There's a lot of amazing belief out there about the AMA. I think it can bring that together in a way like Joe and others were saying, that instigates control or air traffic monitoring that can be seen as independent, that can bring a level of trust together that can change the way that we see this technology being used in healthcare.
Yeah, I think that trust thing, we were talking about, and I think, just all of us at the AMA are really proud of the trust in the AMA, regardless of what you might think about the AMA. We hear this from our physician stakeholders and constituents all the time. There's trust in the AMA, and that's really important. Conrad, looks like you had a point you wanted to make there.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one big barrier to adoption, probably the biggest, is that blockchain is a security technology, and security is very intangible. It's not a checklist item. It's not a new feature that you can add to a product. And so, and as a culture, we don't have a lot of literacy around digital security. and essentially all the things you can do with blockchain you can do without it. It's just a lot more secure. So that just makes it very hard to, as a sale in general.
Yeah, that's great. Well, one of the things I wanted to go to, and actually if we could go to sort of the hype cycle on blockchain, because for all of these issues, so we've got privacy, we've got adoption issues, we've got perhaps trust issues, maybe scalability issues, but progress being made. We talked about governance and how do we control these systems, who has the rights to do what. We also know that in the technology world and any of the health information technology vendors out there, everyone's doing blockchain something. So what should we be thinking about the hype cycle? And maybe if we look at the financial industry as maybe as someone that we should be relating to. I'm just curious as to, I've got a Gartner hype cycle chart up there in terms of where technology falls, and blockchain is a little bit past the crest of the maximum hype that's out there. I'm just curious, what do you think? Is blockchain ready for prime time in healthcare? Is it all hyped up right now? Where do you think we are? Maybe Chris, we could start with you on that.
They picture blockchain in the trough of disillusionment, which is where I believe it really should exist right now. There was too much hype on it, especially from the financial world and the escalating prices of cryptocurrencies and stuff. But I think for blockchain to have big implications in healthcare, we're probably about 5 years off. Some people will put it at 10, but I think the problems in healthcare are so vast that I think we're going to see adoption of blockchain to begin to solve those problems much sooner. So if you're going to wait for mass adoption, you're going to miss the boat. So I think you really have to start early and start with small use cases and establish those and then build from there. And then I think as the technology advances, and it is going to advance relatively quickly, that I think we're going to start seeing significant adoption within 5 years, in my opinion.
That's great. Joe, I'd be curious, as to what you think. I mean, you are talking about blockchain every day, all day, Chicago Blockchain Project. I mean, where do you think we are?
Yeah, I like to look at it. Like you imagine the internet as it started moving. That was an infrastructure that allowed us access to information, right? And this new protocol of blockchain is just an infrastructure that allows us ownership of the information instead of just access. It's kind of like thinking about like road technology when it came out. You didn't really think of it like other businesses where like, where is it on the hype cycle? It's like, this seems pretty good. We're probably going to use it for a while, and it's probably going to go through multiple hype cycles. So I don't think if you see it go up again, that means like it's already up and everything's groovy and great. It's probably going to happen a bunch of times. I always like to look back at there's this 1994, 93 video from like NBC with, I don't know, Greg Gumbel or Brian Gumbel, one of the Gumbels. And they're sitting there talking about the internet, and one of them says, I heard it's just for like porn and drug dealers and people doing things. And then you look at articles about Bitcoin like 3-4 years ago, you were seeing the same thing as this public infrastructure. And nobody says that about physical infrastructure. Nobody's like, there's a murder. How'd he get there? Well, he used a car and drove on the road. Let's get rid of those roads. It's just a ridiculous thing. So my mindset is it's going to take time. It's going to be slow. We're going to go through many hype cycles.
Other opinions? Conrad?
Just in general, we don't really know where this technology is going. I'm guessing that in 10 years, nobody's going to use the word blockchain, and there'll be some other data structure or whatever that everyone will be talking about. But the important thing is that the core concepts, the idea of digital signatures, smart contracts, these kinds of things, they're going to be around forever. And if you're technically inclined, if you can learn this stuff now, even if this technology dies, I guarantee you that the thing that follows it is going to have your knowledge is going to transfer very comfortably you can't really go wrong learning how this stuff works.
What does that mean? Let's tap into that. Like learning. So we're all learning. This is a great educational session. But is just paying attention enough, or do you have to be in there and actually doing something with the technology?
What was weird is I sort of got into Bitcoin at first in 2011. But I never actually sent another person Bitcoin or bought a cup of coffee with Bitcoin until 2013. And until you actually use it and you see just how beautiful from just a technology standpoint it works, it's really hard to appreciate why this stuff is so cool. So if you do nothing else, if you can get a friend of yours that's into Bitcoin to send you a tiny amount of Bitcoin and just move it from your phone to somebody else's phone and see how that works, just that it's so easy to do that. And you would learn so much just by doing that, and you would have a much better appreciation.
I did that. I signed up for my Bitcoin account, and it asked for a lot of information. I tried to get one at the little machine. I wanted a nice, shiny $6,231 Bitcoin, but I didn't quite get it yet. So, Ron, what else do we need to be thinking about to learn more about blockchain in terms of getting our hands a little bit dirty so that we start to get comfortable with this disruptive technology?
Yeah, so I would agree with what Conrad said. You got to use it before people are going to understand it. But the other thing, we've been at this for 18 months or so, and in every single conversation, provider or payer or technology company, the first reaction is kind of the head tilt, not quite sure what you're talking about. So I think part of it is just understanding the art of the possible too. You're really reimagining how a lot of these processes behave. That sometimes it's hard to get your head around. So some of it is you got to have some practical hands-on application of it. Reading is always going to be a part of it, but if you're trying to keep pace with what's happening in blockchain by just catching the public information, you're never going to be able to keep up. There's just too much of it every day. So it really is hands-on application and practical use cases. That's why you got to kind of take that pragmatic approach and say, what can I do today? Can I go buy some Bitcoin? Well, that's a good way to start. Can I go solve, a prior auth or an eligibility or some other kind of use case that's a pain point for me, but isn't a real significant risk, and the technology can kind of solve that today. So that's kind of how we're recommending to our customers is just give it a shot, try it out, do a proof of concept, but keep it small, self-contained, and then move on from there.
Yeah, and it's coming. There's no way it's not coming. I want to create some opportunity for our audience to ask some questions. So, as there are questions, please just raise your hand. Our panelists are here, and we have one here. Karen, just we want to start with you. We're gonna get a microphone over to you because we have some people on the phone, so we're gonna want to make sure that we use them.
Hi, thanks so much.
And Karen, why don't you ask your question, and I'll just repeat it for you so that our folks on the phone can hear.
Yes, hi, I'm Karen in our health outcomes area. Thank you so much. I have two questions. One, Chris, you talked about this distributive model actually strengthening the physician-patient relationship. Love to hear more about what you think about that in terms of strengthening that relationship. And the second question was, Ron, I think you mentioned the use of this to make prior auth easier. So a health plan could go in and look at the data and just get that answer. But could you imagine using this technology to eliminate the need for prior auth?
Those are great, and I think, so Chris, maybe you can start with that first question about how does this strengthen the physician-patient relationship?
One of the areas that I think it could help dramatically is we talked about precision medicine and personalized healthcare, giving both parties access to the same information, where now you create a more informed patient as far as what's wrong with their medical condition, what their options are, and where there's the feeling that now they have knowledge and they're on equal grounds, and they look at the physician as a partner, not just as an authority that's going to dictate what you need to do, but now you're on level grounds with information that you could collectively make the best decision on what's best for that individual patient. And I think that brings the two parties a little bit closer together versus, some people don't have too much knowledge about their medical condition. And when we talk to them about what you need to do, sometimes they almost feel like you're being dictated to. This is what you got to do, which in some cases, some people want that. But for a lot of other people, they want to be playing an active role in their decision. And in order to do that, they need to be educated. And having all that data collectively in one spot or under their control, and then using analytics and AI now educates them almost equivalent to a doctor. That possibility does exist. And now they could be more informed and feel more comfortable in the decisions that they're making with their doctors.
Yeah, well, education is certainly something that the AMA spends a lot of time on. So beginning there is great. Don't forget #AMA blockchain. Please, let's get it out there. But Ron, Karen had a second question there, and that's, prior auth is one of those use cases. Can we just skip the prior auth altogether? Can you help us get there? Is there a way to do that? We're going to share the microphones here in the front just so we can get those out in the audience. Thanks.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I mean, the reason for prior auth exists today, simplest level, is because we don't really want to, as a payer, I don't want to really trust that it's a medical necessity until I validate it. Well, blockchain allows you to do that validation through the combination of technology, but it won't be just that. It's going to have to be something like natural language processing that's going to read something in a medical record, look for keywords or something like that. So I think it'll be a combination, but certainly the whole idea around the fact that we developed a governance model, we all agree that we're going to behave this way. We don't really need then to validate that you're behaving that way because the technology takes does that process on your behalf. So you don't really have to do a step of a prior auth. It's done automatically just as a part of the way we've now agreed we're going to work together.
So the technology you're saying it can facilitate, but it doesn't necessarily solve the other problem. That sort of rings true. I was with a bunch of experts in the HIE space yesterday. I'm like, hey, does the blockchain take care of all the issues with the HIE? And I was like, doesn't solve the business model problem. So it's not, a tool to solve all things. I think we had some other questions in the audience. Yes, we'll get a microphone to you and we can just ask the question there.
Hi guys, thanks. So if looking at the hype cycle and just the theoretical to the practical, it sounds, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of stuff that we read about, and I'm just wondering to what extent companies are really using blockchain today to solve real business problems that can't be solved with the centralized data model, which is the one that we're all familiar with.
So what's really happening right now? Maybe Charles, since world peace was coming out of your mouth, I think, in terms of the opportunities, what's really happening?
So there's lots and lots of POCs, proof of concepts going on, lots of consultancy selling, huge amount of it. Blockchain is an infrastructure. Applications like Ron are building on top of it. You got to POC those right now. There's not a lot live, right? There's a few instances of live technology. We've been working with a very large technology stock exchange that's deployed the technology. Latvia, Lithuania, Austria, Estonia, Switzerland are building out platforms to do very specific tasks. Yeah, right now it's limited. In the healthcare space, lots of talk, lots of hype, people building databases for this technology inside central data centers. Yeah, it's not distributed, the apps aren't there, but it's being enabled. And that's kind of like everybody turning around and saying, everybody uses FHIR in the United States. Yeah. The FHIR technology has been deployed. Is it being used in applications yet? Not yet.
Yeah, and that's what Ron was saying too. Lots of proof of concepts happening at Mindshift. And so Conrad, what about, in forward blockchain? What are you seeing in terms of real life examples?
So the biggest problem in this space is that there's like a lot of money sloshing around. So there were these big ICOs. There's a lot of venture capital investment. It's a way to do something like a stock purchase on a blockchain, usually with tokens.
Okay.
Yeah, it's initial coin offering is what it's called. And also early investors have a lot of money. So the problem you have is there's no meritocracy. So usually what you want in an industry is you want the bad ideas to fail and people to run out of money, and the good ideas to float to the top, and that's how you figure out what's good. But there's so much money right now in blockchain that there's a lot of noise, and there's no way of telling who has a good idea and who has a bad idea, because even the bad ideas have a lot of money that they can put towards branding, and it'll just take a while for us to figure out what the good ideas are. So that's a huge problem right now.
Great. Other questions in the audience? Right over here, Tayet is going to ask a question from OGC.
Hi, when you talk about validation, are you talking about validation by a person or a machine? And what's the incentive to validate? It sounds like you need a high volume to establish trust or integrity. Maybe I'm not understanding, but I'm just not really quite sure what you mean by validation. I keep hearing that term.
Well, let's go back to our primer. Joe, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I would say that generally what these systems are doing is that you have to think about there's an individual who is contributing time or effort through their hash power, their computer, paying for the electricity for that, right? And then there's an organization, whether it's multiple businesses or a bunch of people collaborating to achieve a goal, whatever it is. They're all working within the framework of the flight. What do we call them? The flight coordinator, the air traffic control. That's right. And these are people who are agreed into that. So that's kind of the organization. Then you have like society outside of that. And generally, all the systems that we're doing are trying to find some way to make a synergy between these different stakeholder groups in any effort that is going to balance out the good for the person, the good for that organization, and then the greater society. That what Bitcoin and its system really does is it allows a market force to determine that rather than a boss or a government. And that's what's found that balance. And because it's open and permissionless, people just opt in or opt out of that system. But the way that it finds value to pay for this is by actually a synergy situation, a literal 1 + 1 is 5 situation, where the system, just like Facebook, if you've heard of a network effect, the system is more valuable when more people are on it. Now, if that is true, at some point you can capture some of that value and start paying it to more people to participate. And that's really what blockchain systems are all about. It's about how do we create systems that are more beneficial to you to participate than not, which is what gets us out of the data silos. And how do we incentivize people to change their behavior that they're stuck in? Well, if it is more beneficial, let's capture some of that value and find a smart way to redistribute it to incentivize more people or incentivize a certain behavior, growth of a network, whatever it might be.
Well, that's great. And one thing that, I just want to comment on, I mean, this has been sort of like a great early introduction to blockchain. And as we can tell already in this conversation, there's a lot there. There's a lot of opportunity, there's hype, but there's a lot of real application possibilities that we, the AMA, should be paying attention to. I know there's many more questions from our audience. Our panelists have actually offered to have additional time with us, that we will have a future opportunity to do an online discussion with our panelists. So I just want to let folks know this is not the last and only opportunity to get your blockchain questions answered. And we were also encouraged as the AMA, get dirty, buy a Bitcoin or a piece of a Bitcoin and transact. And we need to learn, and we have some ideas for some pilot projects that we intend to run here at the AMA, so we can learn more about it. But just as we are at the, nearing the close of time, I just wanted to get one last set of point of views from, this great panel here. And maybe, Charles, I could just start with you. Like, give us, just your closing thoughts in a minute's time frame of, if we think about blockchain as we think about the web, which we've all experienced, as now we do transactions on there, we look to the web for all kinds of applications, and you gave us a lot of them, Netflix, Amazon, etc. What should we be thinking about in healthcare in a 2-year time window? Like, where do you think we'll be? Really short time window, but in 2 years, Where do you think we'll be? Will we be beyond the hype? Will there be real applications? What are your thoughts? Give us about a minute of closing comments.
We won't be beyond the hype. So yeah, no, I mean, the next 2 years is going to be an interesting time. There's definitely going to be a lot around directories, identities, payments. Those are the big three fields.
Awesome. Chris, I'll go to you. You gave us 5 years before we're in real application land.
5 years. But I think what we're going to start seeing is more applications that incorporate blockchain into their applications. And I think developing the proper user interfaces for those apps that really will engage patients to use those kind of apps is going to play a big role. And I think from the physician community, I think physicians really now need to start thinking about how am I going to engage with my patients through a mobile strategy? Because if physicians don't have a mobile strategy, the ones that do are going to succeed and grow, and those that don't are going to run into trouble. Because patients are going to be engaging more and more with their physicians through their cell phones.
Great, Ron.
Yeah, so my opinion is we'll still see a pretty heavy emphasis on the transactional side of healthcare is where a lot of people will, and then we'll probably see some really good proof of concepts on the, potentially on the clinical side beginning to emerge. But I think you'll see the, if anything moves on the hype cycle to where it's more mainstream, it's going to be in that transactional space.
Yeah, I think the main issue is that there really hasn't been a true killer app yet for blockchain technology. And until that happens, it's really just all speculation. And most people that have made money with businesses in the blockchain space have done by building products to cater towards speculators. So what that means is that I think it's almost certain that there will be a killer app, but we don't know when it's going to come. It could be a year, it could be 10 years. And it could be something very specific. Nobody knows what it is. And when it comes, then everything will fall like dominoes, and there will be a beachhead, and all these other use cases then become feasible because this one thing has gotten a toehold. And so it'll happen all at once, but we don't know when. It could be a year, it could be 10 years. I don't know.
And similar to perhaps what we have been seeing in the financial industry, where we started to see the value of Bitcoin hit $1 billion, and then boom, everybody's in. And Joe, what are your last thoughts in terms of 2 years from now where we might be?
Yeah, 2 years is going to be a short time frame to see a lot, but I know from our side, like the people are coming and asking, you're getting fresh ideas, new things every single day. So I think over the next 2 years, we'll start to see what real use cases are, start to see some applications use it. I'd like to emphasize that the decentralizing it or taking the power and putting it in many people's hands instead of a few is an answer for some problems. It's not the goal of the system. The goal of the system is to find better outcomes for patients and doctors and all the people involved. So I think it's great, there's gonna be a lot of like permission ledger use cases that will instruct people and teach them how to understand the governance of the system. As we see some of those run into issues that are better solved by decentralized systems, more focus will go towards that. But I definitely see it as a long thing, 5 to 10 years before we're seeing very, very substantial applications. For sure.
Well, that's terrific, and I purposefully chose a short time frame because part of the education for the AMA and the what's coming, it's our responsibility in terms of the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health to be paying attention to these things, both from a disruption standpoint, but in terms of where the opportunity is in healthcare. On behalf of the AMA, I really want to say a sincere thank you to our esteemed panelists for this great education. This was awesome. #AMA blockchain. We're going to learn a lot more together. Thanks so much, guys.